Thanks, Ron. It's great to be here. And this is the type of audience I don't get often enough a chance to speak to, security professionals and folks who are really tuned into the technical details of, what I would characterize as a crisis of misinformation. And as Ron said, Adobe is uniquely positioned. We're not a social media company. What I'm going to show you and talk about is not a revenue generator for Adobe in any way. This is us and my team in particular with broad partnerships across industry that I'll also talk about. Trying to fix a very tangible and critical problem that we have around misrepresentation of content and increasingly simplistic, simple to use tools for creating fake media, if you will. So as Ron said, I'm Andy Parsons. My role is as director of the Content Authenticity Initiative at Adobe. I have a relatively small team given the size of the company, but we kind of cross a number of sort of vertical areas in the initiative, just one of which is building these tools that I'll show you into Creative Cloud, and I'll get into the other pieces that we cover with the team as well. So I just want to kind of characterize the problem, and I don't think any of this will be news to this audience, but we did some research just last year in the US and UK and Europe, and we found that in general, content consumers, this could be anybody, Facebook consumer, Twitter consumer, viewer of NFTs and art and such, 63% of content consumers that we surveyed said that content they saw was fake 63% of the time. And 72% of creative professionals, where obviously Adobe has a tremendous footprint and reach, said the same thing. So, I think these numbers are probably greater across the broad worldwide populace, especially in certain regimes. But in general, this sort of cemented the fact that we have a gigantic problem. And quite frankly, Adobe tools are sometimes used to create problematic images. So I'm going to talk about three things today. What is the Content Authenticity Initiative and why are we doing this? Who are we doing it with? Where are we now in the initiative? This is by no means a complete project. We're sort of at the nation early stages of what we're doing, but we've made some impressive progress, I think, across the ecosystem. And then to make this concrete, I'll spend a few minutes at the end showing you some examples in UI, in Photoshop, and other places that will hopefully make this a bit more clear in terms of what the manifestation of these ideas is going to be. With any luck, I'll have a few minutes at the end for questions. So, why is Adobe doing this and why are we here? We've seen tremendous advances in AI, again, democratized to the point of, if any of you have teenagers or kids, you've seen amazingly incredible tools for, disinformation and misinformation in tools like TikTok and Snapchat and things like it. Not to mention apps like Reface that, for fun and entertainment, use some very sophisticated algorithms on a mobile device that can create entirely synthetic human beings, synthetic locations, remove things from images, add things to images and video. So this is not going to slow down anytime soon. As they say, the genie is out of the bottle. And again, some of the tools that Adobe is creating are increasingly AI empowered. And that's a good thing. We want creators to be able to use AI to do their jobs faster, better, and frankly, be more creative and create new types of content using AI. But they have to use those tools responsibly. And when we looked at what we could do at Adobe in the way of creating a standard and also implementing it ourselves, we thought a lot about responsible use. And what would we do to enable users of Premiere or After Effects or Photoshop or Lightroom to use these AI tools responsibly? And what we came up with was Content Authenticity, which at the highest level is a way to add cryptographically verifiable metadata about how something was made, what we call provenance, into the image or attached to the image in an immutable way. Add to that equation, a general intent to deceive. Ron mentioned the election. That's just one of many examples, perhaps the most powerful one in recent times, but not a day goes by that we don't see content being miscontextualized, whether it's fake or not. We see cheap fakes, deep fakes, and everything in between. And overall, a real lack of transparency. And when I talk to some early creators of the internet, I've heard more than once that should we be able to go back in time and recreate the internet, we might put in place a layer at the protocol level for transparency, trust, and attribution to know what the content actually is. So we're on a long journey to effectively do that with the initiative. This is a slide I've been showing and talking about for over a year. This goes back to 2019. Hard to believe it's been 2 years since this sort of election disinformation began coming around. We don't have to attribute this to any particular person, but this was shared on Facebook. This was Nancy Pelosi, very simply, in a very rudimentary way. Video frames were slowed down, sound was altered. And for all we know, an Adobe tool may have been used to do this, but something much less sophisticated could have been used as well. This went viral in a crisis of sort of policy. Facebook did not take this particular video down. And unlike the old days of newspapers, there's no such thing as a retraction or a redaction. Once this is out, should it fit your worldview, we know that people tend to share it. And we have this virality of truly deliberately misleading information here. So fast forward 2 years, as I said, we have lots of tools and techniques for doing these kinds of things for fun, for entertainment, for creative purposes, and of course for malevolent purposes as well. One important kind of facet of the race against deepfakes and preventing misinformation and deliberate disinformation is detection. Using AI basically to counter AI tools, the likes of which I described earlier. We think in the long term, these techniques are likely to fail. And by fail, I don't mean that they won't become increasingly sophisticated, but effectively, we think the bad guys will win, and that the speed of development of closed systems for creating AI for deceptive, malevolent purposes will outpace the ability to detect these things. And if you just look at kind of the history of Hollywood special effects, which were made, until recently with budgets of millions of dollars, and special effects artists who were able to do this uniquely, when you democratize those techniques and allow, specialized processing on mobile devices, desktop devices, specifically for AI manipulation, it's not hard to imagine that in some number of years, it will be increasingly and eventually fully difficult or impossible to detect deepfakes in video images, not to mention other types of media like documents and audio. So, we need look no further back than just last year in the Deepfake Detection Challenge, which some of you might be familiar with. This was co-sponsored by Facebook and Partnership on AI, where I sit on the Media Integrity Steering Committee. And we sort of had a front row seat to how this thing unfolded. And ultimately, the winning algorithm for detecting deepfake 10-second videos with synthetic content only had a 65% hit rate. And when you consider Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, social media scale, that's not much better than a coin toss. So we looked elsewhere as Adobe. Again, I don't want to take away from these tremendous efforts that research, academia, many of our co-technical leadership companies are working on. Detection is critically important, but we think we have to go further and establish this foundation of trust online. So instead of guessing what's false through heuristics and algorithms and AI fighting AI, we think we can prove what's true. And when I say what's true, I want to be careful here. We are not talking about the veracity of the media that's captured to say that this photo is absolutely of me or of a particular news incident, but instead to find and distribute and be transparent about ground truth about who created something when that's appropriate and how it was created. I'm always excited to show this slide because it's perennially out of date. These are just a few of the highlighted partners in the CAI. So the CAI is an Adobe-led initiative with many, many partners singularly focused on this idea of content provenance and proving truth about how media came to be and whose hands it passed through on the way and how it was manipulated before it gets to a fact checker or an end consumer. I think now we're up to well over 300 members, and I'd urge you to check out our website at contentauthenticity.org to get a better sense of how this works, what the participants are creating in terms of prototypes, and the kind of work that we're doing. And these are just a few of the leaders in the initiative, along with Adobe. So I want to talk about, what is this really at the end of the day? I've talked a lot about the problem, about, purported solutions and something called provenance. So let's get into a little bit more of the specifics and how it works. My team, as I said earlier, focuses in many areas, and these are all, equally important. I would say in order of the time that we spend inside Adobe and outside with our partners. Number one, and perhaps most important of all, is creating standards via a nonprofit that is not Adobe. And we created something called the C2PA earlier this year, Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, specifically as a standards creation organization that would draft the technical standards for Adobe and others to implement. And I'll get into some of the specifics of what that body is doing and the milestones we've hit so far. Second is implementation through collaboration with CAI members. And this has taken many forms, including hardware prototypes on mobile devices. We did an interesting partnership with Qualcomm just a few months ago, where we showed that provenance data, ground truth about capture, can be captured on a hardware device with a secure execution environment, moved into Photoshop or Adobe tools, then published on the New York Times, shared on Twitter, all the while maintaining this level of confidence and trust in the certifiably, cryptographically verifiable metadata that it explains how this was made and in some cases who made it. Third is education advocacy. We have a team dedicated to outreach, to making sure that we understand all of the potential harms, abuses, and use cases where content provenance will be extremely useful in the next few years, and long-term as a kind of ground foundational standard on the internet itself across hardware, software, web browsers, mobile OSs, all of those areas. And lastly, of course, we endeavor to create kind of the gold standard exemplary implementations inside the Adobe Creative Cloud, uniquely positioned as Adobe because we touch the lives of so many creative professionals, from photographers to Photoshop artists to 3D artists, and even those very special effects artisans that I mentioned earlier. So digital provenance in our kind of terminology is that ground truth I described earlier, mostly about how something was made and the ability to capture kind of before and after thumbnails for images, snippets of video, so that an end consumer consuming this information can tell how something changed over time. And in some cases, it would include who published it as a layer of trust, in addition to who was the Photoshop user, who was the photographer, with full affordances for privacy considerations, which are absolutely top of mind in all of this. Two key product concepts for people implementing this sort of early standard, including us at Adobe. Number one is that we have to make it as simple as possible for creative professionals to use this provenance data, to create it, to imbue their images and videos with this information. This cannot be something that impedes their workflow, makes it slower, or anything of that nature. Second is to make it intuitive and ultimately expected for content consumers, fact checkers, others looking at media, sometimes with a skeptical eye, especially in news consumption mode, such that in the future, if you do not have CAI or C2PA metadata based on the standard, you might look at that news content with an extra eye of skepticism, because you would expect it and intuitively assume that the data is present. So what is this metadata I've been referring to? You know, we're trying to create as little novel technology as possible, but if you will, the novelty is in gluing together existing technologies to make this possible, performant, and possible on small constrained devices as well as web browsers and other environments. It's based on a fairly simple structure for storing and accessing this verifiable metadata, for verifying it every step of the way. So when you're going to manipulate or edit a piece of media, it first is verified, and then additional information can be added, signed, and the chain of provenance can be continued downstream for eventual viewers and publishers. And secondly, you know, the metadata itself comprises what we call facts. I would use facts in quotes because, again, we're not talking about the veracity necessarily of what was captured, but individual bits of information that can help you understand what something is and whether it's real and whether it's trustworthy. Sometimes folks ask us, you know, isn't there metadata already in images and video? Can't we use that? Aren't there, you know, decades of work around creating standards around interoperable metadata? Of course, that's true. There are many different flavors of photo and video metadata, but it's not tamper evident. It can be easily co-opted and misused and leveraged by bad actors to change a date or change a location or stick in a fake GPS coordinate system, things like that. With CAI metadata, the idea is to make even that information that was captured in camera verifiable, cryptographically sealed, and then to add additional information around what we call assertions, claims, and manifests. These are sort of the data building blocks that make up this metadata that can be displayed in a UI that I'll show you shortly. And most importantly, it's tamper evident. If someone were to try to edit the data, be it metadata, pixels, frames of a video, it's immediately clear to a consumer system downstream that something has been tampered with. Consumers can be warned that that is the case. These are just some of the assertions that are in the standard as it stands right now, which is out for public review. I'd urge everybody here to take a look, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But effectively, the identity of the photographer or the creator. This is all optional. Everything I'm going to talk about from here on out is opt-in. There is no conception of this being used or misused for surveillance purposes or for violating any privacy concerns, anything of that nature. But this list here will give you an idea of the kinds of things that can be captured if a creator, a professional of any kind, chooses to opt into this. Just to illustrate what I've described, this is sort of an illustration of a top to bottom publishing ecosystem. You can think of this as a simplistic, illustrative news photojournalism kind of graph from top to bottom, where initially we create a photo, someone in the editorial room edits it, we publish it, we then share it on social media, and then we view it as an end consumer on our favorite news site or social media platform. When this is created, we use trusted execution environments and hardware to capture perhaps this and other things: the creation date, who created it, perhaps the photographer, GPS location, things like that. This can also include a depth map as another example, so that we're sure that this initial captured media is not a photo of another photo or a rebroadcast of an image of a high-res computer screen, for example. When we get to editing, we can add additional things. Who's the editor? When was this edit done? What are the actions that were done to this image? And downstream, a viewer can decide whether those actions or edits, transformations, manipulations are editorial in nature, whether they change the underlying meaning of the pristine image from the camera, or whether they are, simply lightening, brightening, changing shadows for clarity, for example. On the publisher side, a publisher effectively can vouch and say, if this is the BBC, one of our partners, if you trust the BBC and its fact-checking and sourcing methods, and the BBC simply puts their stamp of approval on this using the CAI metadata, you can see that no matter where you find that image or video, that it came originally from the BBC. And this continues downstream through the sharing and viewing experience, ultimately for a viewer to be able to decide whether they trust the content and what it purports to be or not. There are a number of guiding principles. Again, these are laced throughout the specification we just published, and also on the CAI website. Privacy, absolutely number one. We don't want this to be misused or misunderstood, such that anonymity is not guaranteed, should it be necessary. We want to make sure this is accessible to anyone who needs this technology. Affordances for misuse are properly addressed. So there is threats and harms modeling well underway in the C2PA standards organization. That this is simple to use, interoperable, and extensible. And I just want to say a word on the extensible side. Side. We know that we don't have all the answers for different types of media that consumers will use for art collection purposes, for news purposes, but the fundamental ideas here we think translate very well to audio next in the near term, and then documents, 3D assets, and media that we haven't yet even conceived of. As long as it can be sent to a device or something embedded in your retina eventually, we think that the fundamental ideas of the CAI will hold. So let me talk briefly about where we are. Going back to 2019, spurred on by the Nancy Pelosi deepfake, cheapfake, and other kind of early signs that this was going to be a major problem, and that Adobe wanted to make sure that our users could make use of AI in a responsible way, we announced, in partnership with the New York Times and Twitter, the Authenticity Initiative. And then my team got to work on two critical areas. One is to begin to prototype, to write a white paper to prototype early implementations and make sure that what we thought was possible was in fact possible, performant, and everything else. And then to begin to outreach to other partners to build a broad ecosystem and alliance that would work together across hardware, human rights, software, publishing, et cetera. About a year ago, we published the CAI white paper, which is still available on our website, that laid out the fundamental ideas of how cryptography, distributed ledgers, and other tools could be used and brought to bear to build a broad ecosystem for authenticity. We showed this in a Photoshop private beta that was demoed last year at Max, just last October. And then fast forwarding, we've done a number of interesting implementations, notably a project we did with Reuters and something called Project Starling from Stanford University, where we deployed a set of images taken by Reuters photographers chronicling the period between the election and Joe Biden's inauguration. All of those images are imbued with CAI metadata, and for that reason, trustworthy, verifiable, et cetera. And then fast forward to now, basically 1 year after publishing the CAI white paper, we have, I think just about a week ago, precisely a week ago, opened up a publication of a draft specification from the C2PA standard organization that lays out in great detail the technical specification that anyone would need to implement this, what we hope will become a widely adopted standard. So the C2PA is sort of a sister organization of the CAI. Again, it specifically focuses on developing standards for the purpose of content provenance. These 6 companies, including Adobe on the left, are the founding members, but I think we've got going on 50 contributing members across academia, technology, human rights, and they're all listed on the website as well, should you be interested. Again, all unified around creating the standard for content provenance, and then organizations like the CAI, in concert with all of our partners, are about outreach, education, and most importantly, prototyping and implementation and rollout. So the C2PA is part of the Linux Foundation. It's run under a project structure called the Joint Development Foundation, JDF. And this moves these efforts out from under the umbrella of any particular company into the public eye. All of this is done in the open. We use the W3C IPR policy, so there's no patent encumbrances. The aspiration is to have no licensing whatsoever. The requirement, I should say, is to have no licensing encumbrances whatsoever, to have this be open, and also bolstered by open source, which the team involved in the C2PA is also actively pursuing now. And let me wrap up very quickly by showing you some examples of what this looks like now, hopefully to make this a bit more concrete. This is a screenshot of Photoshop. There's a feature here in Photoshop called Content Credentials. Don't let that throw you. This is the content authenticity feature as it's branded in Photoshop. You can see on the right, this is opt-in. That blue button says, I want to attach this data, or I don't want to attach this data. In the center there on that Content Credentials panel, you can begin to see what we're going to capture as you work through your work stream. So here we have a stock photo of the pyramids of Giza, and something that's going to be added to produce snow. This is sort of tongue-in-cheek misinformation. It did not actually snow on the pyramids of Giza. This is what that would look like after being exported from Photoshop. You can see that same detail has been shared with consumers. This is live on Adobe's own social media site called Behance for creators. And you can see here, if you saw AI assisted for what was purporting to be a news photo from a trusted news agency, you might look with an eye of skepticism. You might say, why was AI tooling used to produce this image? I think maybe it's not newsworthy. And should you wish to learn more, you could click on that View More link. This is a site that's also live at verify.contentauthenticity.org that will show you the entire history of all of the images, their CAI metadata, their parentage, all the ingredients that were used, and all of the individuals, should they share identity, tools, and signers that were involved in producing this cryptographic chain of provenance. I'll skip over these in the interest of time. Also, you can see on the site, because we capture thumbnails as part of the fundamental binary metadata, you can do things like A/B comparisons on this Verify site. It's not meant to be the only clearinghouse for viewing CAI metadata, but it is effectively an early prototype that we're experimenting with, and many of our partners use as well to verify the metadata they're creating and publishing. Here's the equivalent on the New York Times R&D site, which launched a couple of months ago. They call this secure sourcing, but again, uses the same underlying code and technology underlying the CAI. And finally, this is a screenshot of the 78 Days project I mentioned earlier, where all of these images were captured with CAI metadata. They were published on the Reuters site, and what we're calling content record here shows you that metadata, thumbnails, details of how something was created and transformed. And in fact, this implementation, interestingly, uses a distributed ledger blockchain technology to underwrite the trust of the data structure. So as I suspected, and I mentioned to Ron when he reached out to me to speak about the subject, half an hour is not nearly enough time. My goal here is, I hope I've piqued your interest. If there's time for questions, I'd love to take any questions now. But that we can continue the conversation, please visit the website, contentauthenticity.org. Reach out to me directly, and should it be of interest to you or your organizations, please help us. This is a broad industry initiative. This is not something that we intend to do alone as Adobe, and we've had great success so far with our partnerships, and we'll only succeed with greater velocity if we can do this in concert with even more partners. So thank you very much for having me. Ron, thanks for the invite, and I hope that gave you a sense of what content authenticity is all about.